All right, now our next speaker is Professor David Nutt. Now, when I came up to Joburg a couple of days ago, I went to the trial of the plant for a day, Wednesday. And there were delays, and he was put on the stand after lunch. So I've got a problem here, because it took an hour and a half to talk about his CV. So make yourselves comfortable. I better get my glasses out for this one. Professor Nutt is a psychiatrist and professor of neuropsychopharmacology in the Department of Medicine at Hammersmith Hospital and the Imperial College London. His work focuses on the use of brain imaging techniques that he uses to explore the causes of addiction and other psychiatric disorders, as well as the search for new treatments. In addition to his many medical and scientific qualifications, he also holds an honorary Doctor of Laws degree. He is currently president of the European Brain Council, founding chair of Drug Science, the leading independent scientific body on drugs in the UK. And previously he has been president of the British Association of Psychopharmacology, the British Neuroscience Association, and the European College of Neuropsychopharmacology. In 2010, the Times Eureka Science magazine voted him as one of the 100 most important figures in British science. And science in Britain is big. In 2013, he received the John Maddox Prize for promoting sound science on matters of public interest while facing difficulty or hostility in doing so. He is a fighter. And in 2014, he won the Transmission Prize for, amongst other things, his original work as a science activist and his excellent communication skills. He has published over 450 original research papers, 8 government reports on drugs, and 30 books. And if you haven't read his book entitled Drugs Without the Hot Air, please get yourself a copy, as this book is, if I may use a much abused phrase, the gateway to an enlightened understanding of the science of drug use. Please welcome Professor David Nutt.
Well, thank you, Keith, or should I say my lud? Or my lord, of course, as you would say it here. Let me get my slides up there. There it is. Oh, that's the second one. There you go. There's the first one, in case you didn't know what I was talking about. So I think I might stand on here, make myself even more important. Yeah. Okay, it's great to be here, and for those of you who watched the court case yesterday, I'm afraid it's only the jokes that are different. They didn't allow those in court for some reason. So here's the first one. Here's the first one. Here's, yeah, it is the first. Here's me being sacked. This is me being pulled out of my post. I was sacked from my position as the government's chief advisor on drugs in 2009. The hand over my face is that of the Home Secretary, the Minister for the Interior, who's trying to shut me up. And he's trying to shut me up because I was making comments about the relative harms of cannabis. You can see the book of cannabis falling from my hand there. And you can see the scales of justice on the bottom left-hand corner. This is a wonderful cartoon. It makes me look 10 years younger. And it's also really sums it up. The scales of justice sum it up, don't they? Because on one side you've got beer and fags, and on the other side you've got strange green chemicals in plastic bags. And I was arguing that the beer and fags were the problem, and that the hysteria that my government and your government and most governments in the world create around drugs like cannabis or synthetics is largely a smokescreen to avoid confronting the big problem, which is beer or alcohol and tobacco. that was deemed as too politically unacceptable a sentiment to be talking about, so I was sacked. And of course, one of the big mistakes governments make is making irrational decisions like that get the debate from something that's rather in the edge of the sort of political scientific arena right into the media. I'd never be on the front page of a magazine like The Week as a cartoon character if I hadn't been sacked. So they gave me the oxygen of publicity, and I'm grateful to have been able to take it, and I'm still breathing it today. Thank you. But the subsequent events have shown that I was right, and none other than the great authority himself, Barack Obama, has now agreed with me that cannabis is less harmful than alcohol. And that was a remarkable statement. It was the first time in history an American president has ever told the truth about drugs. It certainly changed the whole tenor of the debate in America around cannabis, and it does effectively allow the rest of the world now to get on and make its own mind up. If America cannot control its own people's determinations about cannabis, it no longer has the authority. It never did have the authority, of course, but it had the power. Now it really doesn't have the power or the authority to determine how your drug policy or our drug policy is made. So this was a truly transformational, it's a groundbreaking statement. America no longer can direct drug policy around the world. And that's great news for the WHO and for the United Nations and for you and me. We've just got to make sure that the Russia doesn't fill that void, but hopefully we can be aware of that possibility and prevent it happening. So now we're all free to do what we want. We can make our own drug laws free of the American hegemony, which has lasted for getting on for nearly a century. And all your drug laws are made by America, and all mine are, and Ethan Nadelman at the end of the day will confirm that. But I'm a scientist of sorts, and I want to get to some of the core issues relating to drugs and drug policy. And here's an important one. What is a drug? And perhaps even more importantly, who should say what a drug is? Well, there are various different interest groups in the field of drugs. This is one I used to be part of. I used to be a pharmacologist, and a pharmacologist says a drug is something that, when given to a rat, results in a scientific paper. And if you'd wondered why I got so many publications, well, I've worked with a lot of rats. And there's another viewpoint, which is the viewpoint of the drinks industry. The drinks industry says this: say no to drugs. That way you'll have more time to drink. Now, of course, alcohol is a drug. Everyone knows that, except governments. And particularly governments who get paid lots of money by the drinks industry. And I haven't got time to go into it, but my government is fundamentally corrupted by the drinks industry. I imagine your government is too. And the drinks industry are one of the most sophisticated purveyors of disinformation there's ever been. And one thing they have done is they have learnt from the tobacco industry. They've learnt what not to say. So they don't say alcohol isn't addictive, because that would be a lie. What they say is drink responsibly, which of course is exactly the reason why people don't drink responsibly. Alcohol is used so that you can't cease to be responsible. So there is a kind of a sophisticated logic in their approach at present. But they're very, very powerful. And they have in America been influential in trying to block state legislation which will liberate access to marijuana. And I have no doubt that they are partly behind the opposition to changing the drug laws in your country as they are in other countries. But there's another lobby group, of course, which are parliamentarians. And my definition of what a drug is here, something a politician once used but now regrets. And these are two quotes from politicians who've been quite influential in my career, and in drug policy. The first one was a woman called Jackie Smith. She was the Home Secretary, Ministry of the Interior. And when she was made Home Secretary, she was asked the question that all politicians, particularly Home Secretaries, get asked: have you ever taken a drug? And instead of telling the truth, which is, yes, but I only drink half a bottle of Chardonnay a night, she said, I smoked cannabis, but I didn't enjoy. And I love that statement, because she's head of the judiciary. And not enjoying a drug, as far as I know, has never been a defense in court. It also raises a fascinating question why she bothered. And we haven't got an answer to that. So I think it's because you had to smoke cannabis to get into the Labour Party in Oxford at the time, but I'm not sure. And then David Cameron, our ex-Prime Minister, there he is on his playing cards. And when he was made leader of the Tory party, we all had hopes for him. He said, I'm going to change the drug laws. They're not doing what they're meant to do. And he said, I did things when young I shouldn't have. We all did. Now that we we call that the Eton we. Eton being a very important and famous public school in England, where he went, and so did most of the Tory party front bench at the time. And the great thing about Cameron being a conservative is he only did drugs that began with the same letter as the Conservative Party. So cannabis, cocaine. Not sure crystal was around in his day, but he probably would have done it anyway. So I'm here today to talk about cannabis, and there are significant issues that we have to discuss from the perspective of health and health harms. Is it harmful? Does it cause schizophrenia? Does it cause dependence? Does it cause brain damage? Is it useful? What's the ratio of benefit to risk? And the real key question, the bottom point there, is are the benefits sufficient to change the law? And I think most of you probably would say they are, but let's just go through them and see how we can critically appraise the risk benefits. So it's harmful. Well, of course it's harmful, but I'm going to show you that overall it's significantly less harmful than alcohol. Is it medically useful? Well, no better authority than Queen Victoria. You've heard already this morning that she thought it was a very useful treatment for period pains. I'm pretty sure that Arnie was wrong, though. I'm pretty sure she did not smoke a joint. Where are you, Arnie? Do you have personal evidence she smoked a joint? No. So you made that one up, but she used it as a tincture, almost certainly. She used it for her period pains, the pains of childbirth, and sometimes when I'm feeling mischievous, I think, is that why she had 9 children? Did she use it at other times? Were those parties up there in the Highlands fueled by, I don't know, anyway. The reason she used it is that her physician, who was a very important person, Reynolds, was a great enthusiast for this new drug, and he wrote the definitive treatise on the use of cannabis in the Lancet, there you go, 100 years ago or more. In fact, it was a medicine in Britain until 1971. And then in 1971, we finally succumbed to American pressure. The Americans had taken out of their pharmacopoeia at least 20 years before, 10 years before at least, and they wanted us to comply. And eventually, when we brought in our Misuse of Drugs Act in 1971, we took the opportunity to remove cannabis from the Medicines Act. It was a bizarre decision. It was the only time in history that Parliament had decided what a medicine was, or in this case, what wasn't a medicine. And the argument they used, that doctors were misusing it. There were 2 doctors in West London who were prescribing a tincture of cannabis and telling people to drop it onto their tobacco, dry it out and smoke it. And normally what you would do to a doctor that was misusing a drug was you'd reprimand them or strike them off the medical register, which they did. But they used this as an excuse to get rid of the drug from medicine. A bizarre decision, which, as I say, until recently I didn't realize quite why they did it, but it has become clearer that this was because we were getting continued pressure from the USA to have exactly the same drug laws as they did. And I'm almost certain that South Africa, perhaps through the Commonwealth, as it was in those days maybe, or at least you weren't part of it in 71, were you? But you were in 61, was being pressured in the same way. So 100 years ago, we had the most powerful woman the world has ever seen writing to her friends how beneficial cannabis was as a medicine. And 100 years later, we've had this kind of progress. Isn't this wonderful progress? Here's a teacher in her 50s, in a wheelchair. She has cannabis to treat her spasticity, and the police break her door down on a regular basis. Now, she's in a wheelchair, so they know if they press the bell, she'd open the door. She couldn't jump out the window. But no, they smash the door down because the war on drugs gives them not only the liberty to smash people's doors down, but it also pays them overtime to do it. It's a kind of win-win. And now she is in a position where if they do it once more, she has to go to prison. The fourth strike means prison, which is a very difficult thing to do in a wheelchair. We don't have any wheelchair-compliant prisons in Britain. And her whole life now is in the hands of the police. If they choose to break into her house once more, she will go to prison. And that, I don't think that's progress. I think that's a despicable example of the way the drug laws can enable a gross misuse of power. And I would say to you, I really don't think Queen Victoria would have been amused about this, particularly not when she was stoned. Now, my job today is to think through how we can properly appraise drug harms with a view to developing and establishing rational policies. So these are the reasons drugs are controlled. They're controlled because they're harmful, or sometimes they're controlled because they might be harmful. Some of the pressure comes from the media. The media like to control drugs. They can't control much else, so drugs and drug users are something that's easy to try to get control. Politicians can use drug controls as a way of gaining votes, and some of the public also buy into this concept that drug control is a good thing. If we're going to be objective and critical about this, then we have to look at these four key issues relating to the regulation and control of drugs. One is the relative harms of drugs, particularly with reference to alcohol and tobacco, drugs which we allow to be sold. And then there's the issue of the proportionality of harms. Why do we ban people taking drugs when we don't ban other risky activities like horse riding? Are the penalties for using drugs proportionate to their harms? Is it appropriate to execute someone for being in possession of a couple of grams of heroin, as they do in Malaysia and Singapore? Is that proportionate, appropriate? And in the end, there's also the question, well, whether the law does any good at all. Now, I'm not going to talk about the bottom three because I haven't got time, and I don't know so much about those. But the top one is the purpose of today's talk. How can we get the best estimates of the harms of drugs? And it's not easy. One of the problems with making drugs illegal is not only that it encourages the use, usually of more harmful variants, but also it means that getting data is very difficult. So we don't have as sophisticated, detailed data on drugs as we have on some drugs, as we have on alcohol and tobacco. And we also have particular problems when new drugs come along, particularly legal highs and synthetic cannabinoids, because we don't have a very long period of exposure. And to overcome that, we worked several years ago now to set up a model called multi-criteria decision analysis. And there's the paper that came out of our first attempt to do this. And MCDA is a very sophisticated, the most sophisticated way of assessing data sets which cover very different areas of data. Because when we're looking at the harms of drugs, we discover that they range from areas like health, where we have raw data, we have real data. We know that 15% of people who ever once inject heroin will die from injecting heroin. So we have an absolute measure there. To areas like economic cost, social damage, etc., where we have dimensions which are either in rand or dollars or in just perception. So we have a very wide range of different harms. In fact, the first thing we had to do when we started this program, which is over 10 years ago now, was to properly estimate what are the harms of drugs, what different harms can drugs cause. And we set up a conference to do that. And after 2 days of cogitation and getting the 40 members of that conference to write down every single harm a drug could do on a post-it, sticking the post-its around the wall of the conference center, we then were able to condense them down into these 16 different harms. And what you see here on the right-hand side of this slide is what's called a decision tree. And on the right-hand side, you see the 16 ways in which drugs can harm you. They go from, at the top, drug-specific mortality, the likelihood of a drug killing you every time you take it. To the very bottom there, you can see community harm, the social damage to the social fabric caused by drug users. And those, that decision tree actually breaks down into 2 separate major branches. The top 9 are harms of the drug to the user, and the bottom 7 are the harms of drugs to society. And once we just ascertained there were 16 harms of drugs, we then had to go and look at how we can rank drugs according to those different harms, and then get some kind of aggregate score of the harms of drugs. And the process we used is this MCDA process. Here are the 2 economists who developed this, and this is generally accepted to be the most sophisticated way of making decisions where you have complicated data sets. It relies on experts using their best judgment, and it relies on this technique I'm going to show you, which facilitates how you deal with a problem like this. So here's a real picture. This is a place in America called Gold Hill. It was established in 1859. It's got a height elevation of 8,493 feet and a population of 118. And there you go. The total is 100. Now, that's the challenge we face when we're talking about the harms of drugs, because we're talking about different elements with very different dimensions. So you can't just add it up. That doesn't work. And what you have to do with multi-criteria decision analysis is you have to look at a feature we call added value, or in the case of drugs, we're looking at a worsening of harms. And I'll explain how we do that now. We decided to take 20 drugs to start with, legal drugs such as tobacco, alcohol, butane in lighter fuel, illegal drugs like crack and cocaine, and medical drugs like heroin, amphetamine, etc., which were also used recreationally. So it's a wide range of drugs, and covering a very different range of harms and pharmacologies, etc. And the process relies on determining for each of those 16 variables the most harmful drug. And that's put at the top, at 100. And then all the other drugs are scaled according to their relative position on that scale. So a drug which is half as harmful as the top drug would be scored at 50. And a drug 1/10 as harmful would be scored at 10, etc. So this creates a series of ratio scales. And then you can compare ratio scales across those 16 different dimensions. And that's how you can compare economics with death rates, etc. Now, death rates, of course, are a very important variable because we have hard data. At the time we did this first analysis, these were the UK data. Tobacco on the left, leading to about 80,000 premature deaths a year. Alcohol, about 8,000. Opiates, about 1,000. Paracetamol, about 200. Cocaine, 150. And there's cannabis. You can hardly see it, but maybe, I don't know, 5 or 10. It's very hard to know whether cannabis is responsible for any deaths, but it's associated with some deaths because people die sometimes of other illnesses when they have cannabis in their body. Now, deaths can occur in 2 ways. Deaths can occur because the drug kills you as you take it. As I said, heroin will kill 15% of users at the end of the needle at some point in their life. or it can kill you as a result of the consequences of using it. And I'll just give you an example of how those two variables are treated here. On the left-hand side, you have drug-specific mortality. And drug number 2, the red arrow, on the left-hand side is heroin. And that's scored 100. And then all the other drugs are scaled as a proportion of their likelihood of killing you when you first, or any time you use it. And look at tobacco there, number 6, the blue arrow, and cannabis, the purple arrow, number 8. They both score 0. As far as I know, no one's ever died smoking a cigarette, and no one's ever died smoking a spliff. But if you look on the right-hand side, drug-related mortality, the likelihood of using the drug killing you over a lifetime, we see things are quite different. Heroin, the red arrow, is still number 1, but tobacco's moved up to a score of 90. And that is because people who smoke are very likely to die of a tobacco-related disorder. We know that 50% of all smokers will die of a tobacco-related disorder. And so tobacco in the long term is responsible for so many deaths because it cumulatively leads to mortality. And there you see cannabis scoring, I think, down at about 20. So that's an important distinction, the likelihood of a drug killing you every time you use it versus the lifetime consequences of use and mortality. Since we did that in our analysis, another interesting perspective has developed. These two Germans, a toxicologist, Lackmeyer, and an epidemiologist, Rem, have developed another way of assessing the harms of a drug in terms of the likelihood of killing you. And that's called the margin of exposure approach. And this is the ratio of the drug dose you use with the drug dose that could be harmful. And if this is a log scale, so along the bottom you've got scores going from 1 to 1,000. And you see at the very bottom is alcohol. Alcohol is far and away the most risky drug to use because the margin of exposure is of the region of about 2. You can drink a bottle of wine a night, many of you will, but 2 bottles of wine a night could, for small people, be lethal. And at the very top, you have cannabis, or THC, the extract of cannabis, where the ratio between the harmful dose and the usual dose is over 100. And here is the same data expressed as a linear scale, and you can see at the bottom, cannabis is way, way different from all the other drugs because the dose you have to take to harm you is 100-fold greater than the dose you might take to help you, whereas with alcohol, as I say, it's about 2, for heroin it's about 3. So this is another kind of evidence showing the comparative safety of cannabis, at least in terms of physical harm. But there are other concerns which have been raised and continue to be raised by my government and your government, trying to justify keeping cannabis illegal. And one of them is driving, the fear of traffic accidents when people drive under the influence of cannabis or alcohol. And this report is a report that came out recently from the British government's expert panel, led by Professor Kim Wolfe. And here's the graph they show from this report. And it shows along the bottom axis here an odds ratio. An odds ratio is the likelihood of being in a road traffic accident when you've either stoned under cannabis, THC, or drunk ethanol, ETOH. And you can see that road traffic accidents are twice as likely if you're stoned, drive stoned, and they're 8 times as likely as if you drive drunk. And together, there's an additive effect, pushes up to about 12 times as likely. So overall, being stoned has significantly less impact on driving ability than being drunk. And in fact, we've seen this. Now we have new data from the American states which have made cannabis more readily available, and that road traffic accidents from alcohol seem to be falling because as people switch from using alcohol as their favorite inebriant to cannabis, they are less likely to have an accident when they drive because they drive more cautiously. And of course, they're less likely to drive because when people are stoned, they don't really feel that they're a racing driver, whereas many drunk people think that they are. Now, the other area of concern that is being raised over cannabis, and really the last string by which the prohibitionist lobby clings to, is that of schizophrenia and psychosis. And because this is a disorder of unknown causation, often a long-lasting disorder that strikes young people, it has resonated with very many people, particularly those parents whose children have developed psychosis. And the fear of schizophrenia has been used as the justification for keeping cannabis illegal. The reality is this: in the last 40 years, you see here the increase in users of cannabis in Britain, and that's a 20-fold increase in the number of people who've used. And that almost certainly equates to something like a 50 to 100-fold increase in the amount of cannabis used. Now, as I've shown you, there are no deaths. So the justification for keeping it illegal has largely hinged on this idea that it causes schizophrenia. And this is an important question, and it's a question we can address by looking at whether this massive increase in cannabis use, which is the same in all Western countries, has been associated with an increase in the occurrence of schizophrenia and the number of people with either schizophrenia or psychosis. Psychosis being defined as unusual or odd mental processes that don't meet the criteria for schizophrenia. So that can cover bipolar disorder, or it can cover just drug-induced psychosis. And we went back to the Medical Research Council's own database, the very big database of general practitioners, and we looked at the prevalence of psychosis and schizophrenia, either number of people in any year who had that diagnosis. Those are the top two bars. And the incidence, the number of people in each year diagnosed with psychosis, that's the green bar, or schizophrenia, the orange bar at the bottom. And you can see that despite this massive increase in number of cannabis users, there is no increase in psychosis or schizophrenia. If anything, they're falling. And this, of course, is true elsewhere in the world. There is no country in the world that has seen an increase in people with schizophrenia, despite this massive increase in use. So if cannabis causes schizophrenia, it must only cause a very, very small fraction of the people who have it. The reality is, almost certainly, that what people are calling schizophrenia is being stoned. And you laugh, but this is the nature of the assessment. Most of the trials that assess whether cannabis causes schizophrenia, they don't assess schizophrenia. They ask the question, have you ever experienced alterations in consciousness? Have you ever felt paranoid? Well, smoking cannabis is the nearest you're ever going to get to being psychotic. We even use cannabis as a model for psychosis because it models precisely those aspects, the befuddlement and the paranoia. So this is the schizophrenia argument is a very tenuous one, and it's certainly no justification for criminalizing people. We estimated that if you believe the data that cannabis does cause schizophrenia, you've got to stop 5,000 young men or 7,000 young women from ever smoking cannabis to stop one case of schizophrenia. And that is not a tractable public health approach. And it certainly is completely inappropriate to use criminalization to achieve those goals, because that is utterly disproportionate. Well, let me get back to how we then do this analysis. We've got these 16 criteria. We've ranked every drug, all those 20 drugs on each of those 16 scales, a monumental task. And we're left then with the question of, well, that's all very well, but Do each of those 16 variables matter the same amount? Well, of course they don't. And what you then do is a weighting process where you decide which of the scales is the most important and how the other scales differ in relation to the most important ones. So the process is the same as before. You decide which of those 16 harms is the one you care most about, the difference between the top and the bottom, which gives you the most concern in your society. And then you scale all the others as a ratio to that. It's easier to go through with an example. So here you see the 7 harms that drugs do to society. And at the top of each of those lines is the drug which is the most harmful in each of those 7 harms. So crime, environmental damage, you can see family adversities, international damage, economic costs, and community damage. You can see the drug that we thought was the most harmful on those at the top and the one least harmful of those at the bottom. And then you can see our scores. And you can see that the United Kingdom group scored the most important item, economic cost. That was scored as 100. See at the bottom here? Economic cost 100. And then all the others were scaled according to what we thought was the relative importance in our society of those other 6 variables. And you can see the scores at the bottom. We said crime was pretty important, 80% as important as economic cost. Environmental damage, only 30%. Family adversity, led by alcohol, 70% of the economic cost, etc. So you do that, and you do that, of course, across the board. You do that for the harms to others, you do it for harms to users, you take the 2 highest ones of each of those and you scale those, and then, of course, you've got the weights which you can apply across all 16 sets of ratios. And in the end, it turned out like this. It turned out that social economic cost contributed about 13% of the final weight, injury to others about 11.5, crime 10.2, etc. So you can see the contributions of those different variables to the final scores. And here are the final scores. And this has now become a rather well-known graph. I have to say, this is such a sophisticated and complicated process. It surprised me that alcohol came out as number 1. But when you look at it, it makes sense. And it makes sense, to make it make more sense, we've color-coded it. So the blue lines, the size of the blue line is an indication of the relative harm of that drug to the user. And the size of the red line, the relative harm of that drug to society. And alcohol comes out number 1 because of the massive size of the red line. And that is because alcohol is so harmful to UK society. The reason for that, of course, it's widely used. And it's very harmful. It's responsible for over half of all domestic violence, half of all child abuse, a large chunk of road traffic accidents. It costs the economy about 30 billion a year. And those are the costs to others that make alcohol the most harmful drug. If you look to the 4th line across, you see methamphetamine. That's a tiny red line, because we have virtually no methamphetamine use in Britain. It doesn't harm society very much. It does harm the user. The crystal meth blue line is bigger than the alcohol line, but overall it's less harmful to society. And then you see tobacco and then cannabis. On the right-hand side you see all the drugs that the newspapers like to get hysterical about, as well as cannabis, like LSD, ecstasy, mushrooms, etc. So this was let's say a powerful output. It got published in The Lancet. It created a lot of stir. It actually got me sacked, because this was the data on which I said we should focus on cannabis, not on alcohol, rather than cannabis and LSD. And the government doesn't want to do that, because that runs into the battle with their big funders. It's the first time and the only time in my life that one of my scientific papers has ever turned into a cartoon. Hey, guys, there's this Professor Nutt here talking to the police who are about to abuse that cat, which is spelled Q-U-A-T. Now, a lot of people said, well, that's just a load of UK experts, mates of Nutt's, getting around the table and coming up with a random set of data. So what we did, we were fortunate, we got a grant from the European Commission, from the Department of Justice in the European Commission. They were very interested in how they could improve lawmaking in Europe, because they realized that the drug laws had grown organically and arbitrarily. So they gave us a grant to redo this using European experts. So we went to Europe, I conducted this assessment, 30 European experts, 20 different countries. They went through everything. They changed every ratio scale, and they changed every weighting. But the final results were identical. And the correlation between the UK experts and the European experts was unbelievable. I mean, in social science research, this correlation of 0.995 is unheard of. And that tells us that this is an extremely robust process. And I have little doubt that if it was conducted in other countries, it would give very similar results. For the purposes of today, I've decided to take out from the data just the cannabis and the alcohol scores, because I think the key issue in all debates around illegal drugs is how do they compare to the drug that is allowed, indeed encouraged by advertising in countries like yours. And of course that's alcohol. So here you see the different measures, the 9 ways in which alcohol and cannabis can harm people. And here are the scores. And you can see that on every single score, except for dependence, alcohol is worse than cannabis. And I have to say, I think we've been a bit hard on cannabis for dependence, but still. Better err on the side of worse than safer, so we don't get accused of being biased. When we look at others, alcohol very significantly more harmful than cannabis. There's a confound here, of course, which is that the harms to society, to others, is in part determined by the amount of use. But overall, we can see that overall cannabis is 3 times less harmful than alcohol. And as a result of that, I wrote a paper you might want to read by Weissenborn and Nutt. It's called A Tale of Two Intoxicants, Alcohol and Cannabis. And I've argued that a society where the roles were reversed, where cannabis was legal and alcohol was illegal, would be a much more pleasant place in which to live. So I would like to do that analysis here in South Africa, and I've offered that to the government if they want to do it, if they're seriously thinking about changing the drug laws here. But we have done one analysis like this in South Africa, and that's a subset of MCDA, and it's built on this one we did a couple of years ago in Europe, which looks at different formulations of the same drug. And we've done it for different formulations of opioids and different formulations of other painkillers. But this was a particularly interesting one. We've done it for different forms of nicotine. Because some of you will be aware there's a lot of international debate about the safety of vaping e-cigarettes. And we did an MCDA on different nicotine products a few years ago. And here are the results, showing that cigarettes are way, way much more harmful than vaping. 20 times more harmful. And the reason for that is that cigarettes are burning plant material, and that plant burning material causes lung cancer and bronchitis, and that's the green bar. And the red bar, the harm to others from smoking, passive smoking, particularly to children, fetuses, but also the fact that half of all the fires in the world are caused by people throwing away cigarette stubs. And people falling asleep smoking cigarettes. About 4,000 people a year burn themselves to death falling asleep smoking. Whereas vaping is vaping turns out to be much, much less harmful. Well, a few months ago in June, I came to Johannesburg and did the same thing, the same analysis, but this time using South African experts. And you can see they came to almost identical conclusions. Not cigarettes were the most harmful. Vaping was round about 15 to 20 times less harmful than cigarettes. So we know that South African experts can do the process, and we know that they're very likely they would come to the same conclusions. So I'd be very, very comfortable to do an analysis of either just cannabis or a range of different drugs to help you guys work out whether your drug policies are evidence-based, and if not, how can we change them? I don't suppose I will get that invitation, but just in the last few minutes, I want to talk about something very new, something not yet published, which takes another look at the question of drug control, but this time looks at how can we estimate the best forms of policy. Now we've estimated relative harms, how can we estimate the best policies? And this is something we've been doing over the last few years, and this has been funded by the Norwegian government. Norway is a bit like South Africa in one way. It has a significant crystal meth problem. It's very different from South Africa in it's the richest country in the world, and you're certainly not that. But it also has extremely stringent drug control policies, even more stringent than yours. But there are people in Norway who think their approach is disproportionate to the relative harms of drugs, and they have been very slow at developing harm reduction approaches to opiate use, and they have a very high proportion of their opiate users dying. And so they're looking at revising their drug laws in the same way as you are. So they contracted us to work with them to see if we could develop a way of estimating how different drug policies would affect the harms of drugs. And this is what we did. It's a very complicated process. It took 2 separate conferences. The first conference was to work out how many different areas of life can be affected by drug policy. If you change a policy, what do you look at? You don't just look at the number of people who die or the number of people who use drugs. There are many variables. In fact, it turns out there are 27 variables that you have to think of when you're looking at policy. And they fall into 7 areas: health, social outputs, political, public, crime, economic, and the final one, the cost. These are the costs of implementing a policy, the cost of setting it up and running it. So having determined those, we also then had to determine the definitions, because when you're looking at policies, you have to be clear that what definitions you're using to evaluate the comparative outcomes of these different policies. So there they are. I won't go through them, but they're all defined. And they're all defined such that the policy will give the best health outcome. So when you see graphs, the next set of graphs I'm going to show you, up is better for society, not more harmful. And then we had to decide which policies were we going to compare. And there are an infinite number of drug policies, but we decided to look at 4 that are relatively discrete. The top policy is a policy of absolute prohibition, which is currently the policy of most countries to drugs like heroin or cannabis. And the bottom one in green, that's absolute free market. Actually, it doesn't exist really anywhere in the world, except possibly in some of the less developed countries in Africa for alcohol, where there is no control at all. People can sell it to anyone at any age at any time. And then the green one, that's state control, where you have a regulated market that is owned by the state, not by entrepreneurs. And then the pink one, a decriminalized market that you have in somewhere like Portugal. So we took those 4 exemplars of policy, and we then had to look at how each of those would vary or would score on each of those 27 criteria. A massive process. And before I show you the results, I just want to remind you of one thing which we haven't talked about in great detail today, but will help you understand the findings I show you, which is the perverse effect of prohibition. most people say, well, yes, we know prohibition doesn't stop drug use, but it can't do any harm, really, can it? And I just want to show you, well, we've heard about it from Sean, about how it can harm people who use heroin, but in my country, it's producing enormous harm relating to people who use cannabis, because the traditional way of using cannabis was using a herbal mixture which had a mixture of THC and cannabidiol, and that was that's where this happy stony face came from. People who use cannabis in San Francisco, about the time that Don Abrams was starting to work. Is that right? That's a Californian image, surely. In Britain, we've been very successful in eliminating access of Moroccan and Lebanese imports of cannabis. And so we've got our homegrown, and our homegrown is largely skunk. It's largely high THC. And that's one of the problems, that when people use high THC without cannabidiol, they don't get any of the ameliorative benefits of the cannabidiol. So that is a problem. But there's a bigger problem, and this is hugely problematic in Britain now, is that the more we prohibit cannabis, the more people try to get around the prohibition. And they've succeeded in doing that by developing these, or reef manufacturing, these very potent synthetic analogues of cannabis called spice. And there are hundreds of these, and many of them are extremely potent. They were made originally to be medicines, but they were so toxic that none of them were ever taken to medicine. But now they've been resurrected, and they are sweeping through Britain. We have opened this Pandora's box. So the prohibition of cannabis in Britain has now led to this escalation of the use of these extremely toxic substances. Now, you're lucky, because you don't have them yet. And I can just tell you, you've made to make sure you don't get them, because these are killing people from seizures, they're killing people from cardiovascular disease. You do have some of them, yes, okay. But don't make the problem worse. Prohibition of homegrown cannabis will only make the spice market grow. And we don't know if you can put the genie back in the bottle when you've opened a market like this. So the best thing is never to open it in the first place. Okay, well, here are the results. So the 27 variables clustered into the 7 different groups, the 4 different systems of policy, and here are the results. So remember, bigger is better, better for society. And you can see here that state control of cannabis comes out top. So this is a Uruguay model. So Raquel, you must be pleased. You got it right empirically. We've proved you were right. Free market comes second. Decriminalization, quite a way down, is third. And absolute prohibition at the very bottom. For those of you who want to deconstruct the data, you can see that here's one of the comparisons, state control versus decriminalization. Decriminalization wins on one thing only, which is if you have a criminal market, there's no overt corruption of government. Of course, there's covert, but there's no overt, whereas state control provides enormous benefits across those range of different variables. So we will argue, I'm arguing in the UK, the Norwegians will argue this, that at least for cannabis, a state-controlled market is the way to minimize harm, and in many ways maximize benefits, because this will allow research and also tax revenues. For those of you who are interested in other drugs, some of you probably drink, don't you? Well, here's alcohol. And the same is true for alcohol. State control turns out to be significantly better for alcohol than any of the other 3 options. So this process, we think now, is, we validated it. The paper's under review by the British Medical Journal, and I'm hoping that countries will roll it out. And I'm hoping, actually, in the end, maybe even the UN will start to use this kind of proper analysis of drug harms, rather than the arbitrary decision-making process they've used up to now. And I must not forget to tell you this. In December, I went to the meeting of the Expert Committee on Drug Dependence at the WHO to ask them to review cannabis as a medicine. They've been asked to do it. The committee itself have asked the WHO 3 years of the last 4 to provide them with the background scientific review to allow them to do it. And the WHO had refused. They said they didn't have the money to do it. So my committee, we did it. Drug Science did it. We did it with support from the Open Society Foundation. We prepared a report to the highest quality the WHO require to do a review of cannabis. And they rejected the report, saying that they couldn't receive it because they hadn't commissioned it. Well, that's democracy for you, yes. Anyway, we said to them, well, we'd like to see on what evidence you are continuing to say that cannabis is not a medicine. It's a medicine in 18 countries now. And you're saying, and dronabinolo's been a medicine for 20 years. How can you say cannabis is not a medicine when it is a medicine in those countries? What evidence do you rely on? And the truth came out that they rely on the 1934 League of Nations report. They've never updated that report. They've never been allowed to. The US have never allowed them to update that report. So when you say to them, well, that's very interesting, that report must be a very good report if it stood the test of 85 years, could we look at it? They say, well, we don't have it anymore. We have the annexes, but we don't have the reports. So the current international policy of the WHO on cannabis is based on a report which has disappeared. Now, if that's not outrageous, I don't know what is. And so for your country to say, we can't do anything until the WHO move, you just tell them that the WHO hasn't moved in 85 years, it may never move, so just get on with it yourself. And then just finally, for a bit of entertainment, I'm going to tell you what I think. If you do change your policy, at least to have a more rational approach to cannabis, maybe a state-regulated market, if you decide there should be some sanctions for the misuse of cannabis, I'm going to give you some guidance on what those sanctions should be. And the guidance is going to come in the form of what we call the Eton solution. And so this is a true story. These are 2 Etonians. Eton, as I said, it's the most expensive school in Britain. It's the most famous school in Britain. It's produced more prime ministers than all the other schools put together. And here are 2 students of Eton back in the 1980s. David Cameron and Joss Astor. Cameron was privileged. Astor was more than privileged. He was ridiculously rich. And they were together in the same house at Eton. And they both used cannabis. And they were caught. They used to go into London to buy UB40 records, and they would also bring back some cannabis with them. And they were caught smoking. And because David Cameron said that he'd only smoked it, but he hadn't bought it, he wasn't a dealer, he was not thrown out. He was gated, he was not allowed out to weekends, and he was given what I think is the appropriate punishment for the misuse of cannabis. This is a Georgic. Any of you classical scholars? Well, no, I don't suppose any of you are. But a Georgic is a massive poem in Latin. 700 words of Latin, each one saying nil fumari cannabis. And I think that is an extraordinarily rational approach to people misusing cannabis or other drugs. And I will, interestingly, he is an example, and Astor is an example of what Sean was saying. You don't have to be at the bottom of society to suffer the consequences of school expulsion. Cameron wasn't expelled. Astor was. Astor went on to have a life of crime and has had multiple convictions for drug use. Whereas Cameron has gone from being, as the headmaster said, the most difficult boy I've ever taught, to, and I think I probably shouldn't say what I think, but certainly one of the worst prime ministers we've ever had. And maybe he should have been expelled. Maybe that would have saved us a lot of trouble in the long run. I don't know. So, anyway, I just want to finish because we haven't talked about other approaches, and I just think we need to remember there are other communities which have got a longer tradition, perhaps, of using cannabis. And Bob Marley, he certainly didn't make his music bad, did it? And I think his philosophy might be right. Herb is the healing of the nation, alcohol the destruction. So, thinking on that, I'll say thank you for listening, and if you want to buy my book, I'll sign it for you next time I'm here. Thank you.
David, sorry, Keith, 1 second. David, I just want to tell you that after you left the Drug Policy Week, the MCC met, and they are going to do a multi-drug, multi-criteria analysis.
Oh, fantastic. Well done, sir.
And we're talking about perhaps approaching you to look at the policy one as well. And it's probably a little premature to announce that, but I think it's better to announce it because then you can hold people to it.
I will be back.
Shapir Banu and Andy Gray.
Well done.
Had a meeting.
Well, there you have it. What can I say? Nut without the hot air. But really, that book is one of the 4 books I recommend to anyone who wants to learn more about it, especially the scientific stuff. It's very clear. It's humorous. It's everything you'd expect from his speech. Okay, so now I've just got to continue with his CV because I'm only a tenth of the way through it.